Hello everyone, it is August 17th, 2022. It's about, I don't know, 15 CDT. It's Geo-Rant time, Geo-Rant number 181. And we're going to talk about this here. This is a generic cross section. Just going to set the stage real quick before we get into it. That's about 30 meters or 50 feet. There's no vertical exaggeration, which means this scale is the same as this one, with the exception of our little car. Obviously, it's bigger than a real car. And we'll just assume this way is north. And these are rock outcrops. And the black is something else, which I'll get into there, other than just the road that we're driving on. Now, in May, we went to Espanola in Sudbury, Ontario, and I stopped at a bunch of outcrops for a couple of books that I am going to be hopefully releasing this year. And we brought my mother with me. Now, my mother lives in the Upper Peninsula and has lived in Illinois before, so she knows about glacial stuff. She also lived in Montana, Lake Missoula, all that stuff, so she's fascinated by that stuff. I am not a Quaternary guy, I'm a Precambrian guy, so, I'm glad she's interested in it and I encourage it. And she asked me a question when we were out there. It was actually a good question, and I actually realized she pays attention to some of the stuff I say. And I can understand where this question is coming from, especially if you just have a general understanding of geology and you think in the terms of what you're interested in. She's not a professional geologist. She's just a lay person. She likes the glacial stuff, the Quaternary glacial stuff. So basically, what was I going to say? So as we're driving and stopping at all of these outcrops and things as such, I'm going to do this here just a little bit as I talk. Just so you know, these stripes that you see here, like here, I'm drawing now, that's bedding. All right, we're going to assume this is all metasedimentary rock, maybe the Huronian supergroup, because that is out there. Okay, that is in that area. So we're just going to do this way. I just got, good thing it's a dry erase, right? I'll come out of my shirt. Whoopsie. So, all right. You see I'm drawing this here, and she's familiar with the glacial stuff. So her question basically was, Steve, are these rock outcrops floating, basically icebergs, within sand? And my mother, not being a physicist or even taking a physics class, as far as I know, entering her life at all, doesn't know that terrestrial glaciers cannot move blocks this way. She knows they can move boulders, all right? But these are too big, essentially. Rock or glaciers, you have to remember, they act more like fluids on Earth than even rocks do over time. It's why they go down glacial valleys and not bulldoze through mountains, because glaciers don't act like bulldozers. They erode by plucking and abrading, all right? They don't push mountains over, all right? And in order to get blocks this big, you would have to be able to do that, all right? So, but even if this was possible, and that was her question, and we just assume that it is, all right? For something that big, a glacier could probably move. That's probably your limit. And these would be continental glaciers too. So the boulders can get pretty big, but they can't get this big. Definitely not this big, all right? So anyway, that was a good question. Steve, are these erratics essentially on top of sand? And the answer is no. Why not, Steve? Why can't this be the case? I just explained to you one reason. But when we make geologic maps, and say, assuming this is Huronian-ish in age, we know these are about 2.4 billion years old. The Quaternary stuff is, 2 million or less. So obviously these would have to be some sort of erratics. But they're in place. We know that. Structural geology tells us that. And what I'm going to show you here might look like a bunch of guesswork, and then I'll get into why it's not. So I had to explain to her, no, they are not. That's not what's going on here. I had to tell her that these are essentially under the sand. And we'll just say the sand's like that. So if I was to drill I would eventually hit bedrock relatively shallowly. And if I was to drill through here, I would just continuously hit bedrock. How do I know this? Well, through structural geology and those techniques. And I'm going to extrapolate for you here. This is relatively simple. We'll say that we know from sedimentary structures, we'll just say this is a quartzite, that this is younging. We have asymmetrical ripple marks that indicate this is younging. And say over here in this rock, a little more vague over here on this side, but we can tell through sedimentary structures in the green rock that the mud cracks or something like that, say it's a slate, is that way, is younging. Okay, so, well, if these were moving fast and furious through glaciers or whatever, that could get switched around, right? Well, not really, but oh, you guys, there's cats on the bed and there's battle going on. So if this shakes, you'll know why. Come on, guys, stop it. Bela, leave him alone. He just wants to sleep. Hey. Anyway, so what we do is then we take our Brunton, we take our structural measurements. We know this way is younging. So we make our map, and in a map view, you know, we would have our strikes and dips. Cut it out. Guys, you know, this would be just on our map. And, you know, here's 90, so that's pretty much the symbol for vertical. And over here, I don't know what that is, 60 degrees maybe, okay? The rocks are consistent. I have no reason to think that the thickness changes in this area. So I am going to assume this thickness, the unit here, is the same as this here. Now remember, stratigraphic thickness is not visual thickness. In geology, when I say a rock unit is, let's say, 30 meters thick, I mean from the bottom to the top as if it were undeformed, all right? And here, it would be here to somewhere over here, okay? So thickness isn't visual up and down looking at the outcrop, it's stratigraphic thickness. And that's something else most people get confused with too. So I'm going to take my units into the subsurface. Like I said, this is about 30 meters, and that's about 30 meters. So assuming no faults or anything, so I have no reason to suspect those either. So I'm gonna be using my finger here a little bit. This is not going to be perfect, okay? But I can draw, based off my measurements, in the subsurface, continue my red unit all the way down. And my blue unit, I don't know that there's another, there could be another unit in here, but probably not. So that would follow it too. So that's our bedding. And our green would go along the outside and come down and under. I'm just not gonna draw all those lines, and you can, you know, assume those lines go in there too, because we have physical contacts exposed at the surface. So we have a synclinorial structure because based off our field younging direction. So I draw on cross section based off the data I've collected, a hypothesis. And this is where geology becomes testable. Now you may be like, Steve, that's all speculation. You just pulled that out of your hindsight. Well, if you don't know the principles of structural geology, I can see how you think that, but that's not what I did. This works, all right? And we figured this stuff out with geologists, actually, specifically like Van Hise and Leith, back at the late 19th, early 20th century in Baraboo, Wisconsin, that these principles work. And that's how I figured out the Baraboo quartzite was a syncline, not an anticline. All right, and it has subsequently been drilled into and confirmed. Now, I make this as a hypothesis. Some guy comes in later, starts drilling, and theoretically, he should hit these units at about where I say. Now, obviously, it's not going to be perfect. There could be micro faults in here or something I'm not aware of, or big faults, I should say, that I'm not aware of. All right, but based on the field geology in the area, I don't expect any major faults. I don't expect any real thickness changes, you know, within the area of the units. So this is a completely logical interpretation, all right? Those are our contacts. So what happens is the sand sits on top of our bedrock, okay? The sand is not that thick. glaciers did change the landscape a lot. They really did. But compared to the size of the bedrock and the basement, they're insignificant, all right? At least in any real scale, okay? And there's another place where if somebody would have done this, they wouldn't have made a mistake they did. Some of you have heard about the Kola Deep Super Borhole. I did a video on it a long time ago, which is actually my most watched video. I'll link it if I remember to. When they were taking seismic readings to drill the deepest hole on the planet, they hit what they thought was something called the Conrad discontinuity. We now suspect this discontinuity isn't an actual thing. It's inconsistent, it's not global, it's very localized. And the hypothesis was that continental crust, now remember, when they started drilling this, plate tectonics was a brand new thing, okay? It had just come out. So the long-standing notion was that the continents sit on top of basaltic rock like the oceans are made out of. And that's a logical assumption, but it is a very incorrect one, we know now. Now, in some places that does happen, subducting slabs will get preserved partially and they'll be but for the most part, it's not a thing. The cratons are not sitting on vast, flat, basaltic, things between the crust and the lithosphere. All right, at least not slabs. So they assumed that was the case. So they get 7.5 kilometers down and they don't hit anything. Matter of fact, if they had used this, if the Russians had used, well, back then the Soviet Union had used basic stratigraphic structural principles, they would have known what they had. This is just a generic cross section, and this is their surface. I think it goes this way. I could be wrong. They would have known that what they thought was the Conrad discontinuity, okay? And they could have done this from the surface data they had available in the shallow boreholes, and just done a cross-section based off of that. They would have known that their Conrad discontinuity was just a quick change in the dip of the rock as it went into the subsurface before hitting a fault. And that's all they had to do. There's no basalt down there, and continued to be felsic rocks for the most part. It's not that simple. That's essentially what's going on. So we know this works, okay? We know this can lead to very accurate and often precise predictions. The more data you have, the better this will be. So I basically just explained to you why these aren't icebergs floating on sand, which was a really good question. So if you ever want to ask me questions, don't be afraid to ask them. That was a really good question. I know most of you are not professional geologists. This is my mother's, and my mother has never taken a physics class either. So, I know that was a really good question. So don't be embarrassed to ask me questions like that. I'm never going to come at you for asking something like that if I know you're not a professional geologist. Now, a professional geologist would have said something like that, but most of you aren't. And then I just explained to you how we extrapolate and make predictions into the subsurface, which I've done before actually too. Anyway, that's it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And I hope you learned something.